much, and it's so good to see so many friends. And please let me know if you have any problems hearing me. I'll try to speak up or to lower my voice if I'm too loud. I'm just really I was very nervous before. I'm mostly just excited now. As you will see, the tone of our conversation today is really that, right? It really is intended to be a conversation that I think we rarely have the opportunity to have. So I'll show a few slides, but I really think the most important piece here is to be just part of a dialogue that feels a little uncomfortable at times, that I hope will invite us to think about some things that we sometimes, that I certainly take for granted. And I think I was trying to be strategic with the very kind introduction when I sent a few points to Sharon, because I think what I wanted to emphasize with this introduction is that in no way I'm an outsider to the field of competitive and international higher education. So I am complicit in all of the things that we will critique and comment about. And at the same time, I think many of us often feel like outsiders in our field. So let's hold that tension as we start our conversation today. And I think that's really important, right? To remind ourselves that we're never outside of the discourses that we are critiquing and trying to understand more deeply. So I wanted to, please bear with me as I'm switching windows. I just wanted to share my screen. Okay, this is it. Okay, so there it is. So I wanted to start my talk with kind of the title itself, right? And I'm really trying to interrogate this idea of how and whether at all we can engage critically with work that has been framed in ways that aren't critical to begin with. So the idea of framing is important. So I'm showing this picture here. Some things at the forefront, some are not. Some look a little blurred, but I really wanted to emphasize a couple of things. First of all, in my native language, in Spanish, doing and making are expressed by the same word. So I was playing with this idea of doing internationalization work, in which work is a noun. And then when I changed to make, so this idea of making internationalization work, then work is a verb. Right? So it's not about doing a particular kind of work, but making a phenomenon work for different purposes, right? So trying to reappropriate some of these realities and some of these entanglements with the neoliberal university. And I really want us to maybe exercise some, this notion of giving account, right? Giving account to others. I think just knowing the people that I know as part of the network, I know we want to be responsible in our work, but I also know that finding answers is sometimes difficult. And I think relying on each other to make difficult decisions is very important. And also I want to emphasize, and that's kind of like the third attempt at coming up with a title, that we also are deeply flawed as human beings, right? And I want to embrace that. And I wanted to kind of even determine the delivery of my talk today, embracing that, right? So that we are these open-ended walking contradictions. And I think that's something that is important to me, because I think it gives me space to engage with work that I think is important and that I want to do in the best way that I can. So The next idea that I wanted to share before I get any farther in my talk is some of the colleagues, right, that have been my thinking companions in this journey. And one of them is Amy Scott Metcalf, and with her I have been thinking a lot about the performativity and embodiment of internationalization, right? And indeed, as a friend and colleague, she is somebody with whom I'm constantly trying to rethink how I live in the work that I do. But also, in the last few years, I've been part of a wonderful community of practice with faculty members that we all teach in the summer at Shanxi Normal University in China. And they include Carly Mannion, Benjamin Baez, and Eric Dwyer. And it really has been really quite an experience to be part of this group, to be confused with this group, but also to have the space and the forgiving room, right, to make mistakes and to make decisions as well. And also, my dear friend Dan Saunders, who I think his most important contribution is that he teases me every time I start a sentence with "when I was in," because he points that out as an expression of sometimes kind of like jet-setting snobbery. And I'll get into this with more detail, but I think the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes we wear the countries, as I did with my introduction, the countries where we work and that we have visited as badges of honor, right? And I think there is room for that because it's okay to be proud of the engagement that we have, especially if we are going to contexts where other colleagues may not be able or willing, right? And if this contributes to good engagement. But at the same time, I'm very cautious about the fact that in the contemporary neoliberal university, this idea of the jet-setting academic has become a norm that is often imposed on us, right? So those are some of the ideas that I wanted to start my talk with. I also conceptually wanted to kind of share with all of you a research project that Crystal George Mwangi led some time ago, and I made a very small contribution to this piece, kind of looking at how do we understand criticality in international higher education as demonstrated by the published literature. And I think there one of the main points was the idea that research, and in particular research in international higher education, is never value neutral. But that this idea isn't always conveyed with enough clarity or with enough emphasis. And the way I'm very briefly trying to operationalize what I mean by critical is this idea of paying attention to issues of power, inequity, and certainly coloniality, right? And this idea of paying attention to coloniality has been a theme in that informs my research, but also my orientation to higher education work more broadly. So this is kind of the initial set of ideas that are kind of framing how I'm thinking about these issues. So I wanted to emphasize this notion, and here I'm using a quote that the kind of issues that were in my mind in kind of proposing this talk. And I think like this image may suggest there is too much of too much. And I think sometimes we feel that way in higher education. This is rankings season, right? So this is the time where many of our institutions are flaunting the progress that has been made, you know, in the ranking of institutions and programs and so on. So I want to engage with the concepts of excess and ecstasy, right, as they permeate higher education, right? So there is this excess of connection and ecstasy of mobility that many of us are part of. But the other side of this is that we are becoming 24/7 academics, right? And I personally, a couple of years ago, experienced very severe social media burnout, right? And it really wasn't that that I couldn't take the discourse or the content being discussed. What I couldn't take anymore was the constant performativity, right? And having to engage and try to curate an image of myself in these social media spaces. And I think that's just one of the many manifestations in which some of these issues of excess and ecstasy and obscenity are affecting our work. I had referred earlier to the idea of jet-setting academics as kind of the norm of success in the contemporary university. So I think this is a quote that really speaks to this idea, and it really gets to the core of something that that I think is central to our conversation today, is that it's not so much only what we do as the meaning that we attribute and the reasons why we want to engage internationally, right? So this is maybe one step in thinking of internationalization critically, right? So I guess this is the opposite of this critical engagement in internationalization, right? So as I interpret it, this idea of just mobility for its own sake and as a way of just belonging to the discourse of exchange and cosmopolitanism, but not in a way of connecting with people, right, or intimacy or deep connection, but rather just as expression for its own sake. And I think this is something that I'm trying to ask myself, right, and to engage with. And it's interesting that this quote is a couple of decades old, right? So this is not referring to something only happening now, right? So we have only accelerated in these developments. So not surprisingly, I wanted to kind of include some notions by Jean Baudrillard that has been also influential in my recent work and in some of my thinking. And I don't want to engage with all the concepts, but I've done some writing in relation to this, and it continues to be kind of in the sphere of the work that I'm trying to pursue. So I just wanted to highlight instead a few concepts. First of all, this idea that every prohibition tends to lead to black markets, right? So what I'm trying to, as we're trying to think about criticality in international higher education, I'm not advocating for setting limits to ourselves or to others, right? Because I recognize the knowledge, the limits, I recognize the risks, right, of these kind of black markets, of mobility, of communication, of engagement, right? So that's an important piece. Also, I'm not arguing, as it may appear from the abstract of the talk, I'm not suggesting that we need to disengage without criticality or without care either. So I think there is power in disappearance. I think sometimes that's the only power that we have, right? So I recognize that sometimes disengaging is the only strategy that we have left, and I'm not willing to give that up. What I am saying with Baudrillard here instead is that if we take it as an art, and he suggests we should take it more like a martial art, I think that's a very appropriate analogy, right? Because we need to be careful that through boycotts and disengagement, we don't end up blunting the edge of disappearance or disengagement as a strategy for promoting change. And then a third concept that is a little more esoteric in Baudrillard's writing is what he describes as the principle of evil, which is different than the more commonsensical understandings of evil. I think to put it in the most accessible terms that have been useful for me, I would say it as this idea of whatever doesn't fit within binaries of good and bad, that's what he refers to as evil, right? So this complexity and incompatibility and things that don't easily fit. And I think that's helpful, right, for us to think about our own work and our own international engagement. And this is what concerns me with the politics of boycott. And since the 90s, Baudrillard was writing about this process of whitewashing. At times he refers to the idea of undoing history, right? He thought, like, in the 90s, we were trying to delete everything from the 20th century so that we would have a clean slate in the, by year 2000. And I think in some ways we have continued this whitewashing and this kind of laundering, almost like money laundering, but laundering of our intentions, of our actions, and the denial, right, of history. And I think this is a very dangerous activity to engage with, right? So, so this idea of whitewashing history may have different manifestations. And I would go as far as saying many of these manifestations are in fact very well intended and they are politically very important. And what I'm suggesting is that we need to engage intellectually with the risks that could be involved in this potential whitewashing. So to use a contemporary example or a recent example from the US, which is where I'm situated, right? In the last few years, there have been very important and I would say politically significant attempts at removing certainly monuments and symbols from the Civil War. And that's absolutely important from a political perspective. It's also very important to do so from a social justice perspective, given that they continue to represent the oppression that particularly slavery and the experiences of African Americans in this country have had. At the same time, I worry about the self-congratulatory processes of these victories, right? I worry about the risk of forgetting that past and forgetting that history. And I also see a value of the discomfort of those constant reminders. So again, I'm not saying that anybody should be re-traumatized or re-oppressed, but I worry that many individuals who haven't experienced that oppression may either forget or may enjoy the comfort or the liberation that comes from not having those uncomfortable conversations. So that's my concern, and that's where I'm coming from in thinking about these ideas, right? So again, he refers to this revisionism that, in my view, continues to happen, oftentimes in denying the long-term effects of colonialism and slavery and many different forms of oppression, right? And I think many governments, particularly totalitarian governments, would really enjoy undoing that history. And I think that's an important reminder for all of us. So I guess to get to the main argument that I'm trying to make here, in speaking of authoritarian regimes, I took this photograph in Poland, and the argument, I guess, that I'm trying to move forward is for us to think of ways to promote global social justice without turning it into a grand narrative, right? So that's the challenge that I want to put in front of all of us, so that then we can reflect critically about the work that we do. And in particular, right, I think the Polish example was important because a few years ago, the Polish government had banned any discourse that would engage with the collaboration role that some Polish stakeholders had with the Nazi invasion, right? So that's one of the many examples that I'm referring to of how dangerous the politics of erasing history can be, right? And I would draw an analogy between that erasing history or whitewashing history with some of the politics of disengagement, right, that we are experiencing today. And in thinking of all of these issues, I wanted to kind of shift our conversation, right, to this idea of giving account of ourselves and doing that in a collective way, but doing so avoiding the risks of ethical violence. And these are concepts that Judith Butler has developed in very compelling ways, right? So sort of saying that ethics is always a collective endeavor, right? That we are only responsible to the extent that we're responding to others. And I think it's really powerful to be part of this network with colleagues that I admire and respect, where we can talk about some of the work, right? So in my public persona as a scholar, you know, people know what I've written, and I know what people have written and presented in conferences. But there are other things that I do as well as an academic, right? So, for example, in the introduction, it was also mentioned that I am engaged with a learning community here at the university. And it's a learning community both for international students and US students, but that was framed as a learning community that includes both domestic and international students, right? So terms matter, words matter. And I did want to complicate this idea of what does it mean to be a domestic student, and when and who gets to be domestic. And I think for me, I tend to bring this complexity to some of the more kind of mundane, perhaps, or more everyday activities that I do. And I think it's important that we question our taken for granted assumptions about travel, right? And again, here, my intent is not being hypocritical. I travel a lot, and I have taken pride in that activity. And I think I am more and more reluctant, right, or more conscious about the risks of uncritical travel and uncritical engagement. You know, I'm also very, very cautious in kind of my own engagement in where I decide to go and under what circumstances, right? I mentioned earlier my teaching in China, and I have been questioned by colleagues about how I feel in doing that, especially as we know the treatment of the Uyghur population in China has become extremely problematic. And I think all of these questions are really important for us, for all of us to engage with. And at the same time, I recognize that I'm also kind of enjoying the benefits of having become an American citizen a couple of years ago, and that my country also is rejecting refugees and is having children in cages and committing some very serious violations of human rights. So I think I want to return with these thoughts back to the idea of the risk of disengagement, right? So it's not only, I don't think we can just depart the spaces, right, where we disagree, but on the contrary, I think we need to engage in more creative ways. And as I was thinking through this has been quite, like I've gone through a lot of trepidation, as I'm sure many of us have. I rediscovered this notion of care and how important it is in informing the work that we do. And here I want to credit Verena Conley in a 2016 article titled "The Care of the Possible," where she explores the notion of care and kind of unpacks the idea of care as both a positive and as a negative, as having both positive and negative connotations. So I'm just going to read a very short quote about it, right? So in this context, care involves, quote, supplying provisions necessary for the upkeep of health. So that's the positive aspect of caring, but also of the general responsibility, caution, attentiveness, and concern, and a willingness to look after and to relate and to engage with, right? So in other words, caring involves caring for something, but also being careful to avoid potential harm. And I think that's an important consideration to have when we are thinking about our international work. In continuing with this, right, with this thinking about caring for the possible, right? We need to think about, again, not only what can be prevented, right? So caring for the possible means avoiding some negative potential scenarios, but also promoting those that we can imagine, right? And imagining new situations, but doing that in collaboration with passion. And this would be really, really important, with some joy and enjoyment, right? Which is something that sometimes our everyday activities at work are deprived of. So I did want to spend the majority of our time with our discussion. I think this is just the sketch of the main ideas that I've been kind of grappling with. And I really would like to instead turn it into more of a conversation where we can engage with each other.